Welcome in. So today we're going to talk about GCP in terms of not only just the regulations, but practical application and implementation, how we actually use this information. One of the things that we see when we go out and audit is that people may be following their own practices or what the sponsor has told them are best practices or what they're being guided to do, and maybe not always being rooted directly in the regulations. So we're going to talk at a high level about the regulations and then talk about additional regulations that kind of structure what we do, regulatory authorities, state laws that we have to be mindful of as well when we're conducting research in those areas. So we'll look at the elements of a functional quality system as well. So from a site perspective, certainly something that has been focused for the last many years with regulatory authorities is how are you meeting these obligations? How do they all come together? We'll look at recent trends in noncompliance as spelled out by the FDA and what they provided for us in fiscal year 2014 findings. We'll look at the role of SOPs in good clinical practice, really structured from a site perspective. Again, the regulations are not required or do not require SOPs for the sites, but this is where all of these elements are coming together and all these systems are functioning. We'll look at some of the high-level differences, certainly between different products, but as we talk through this, look at differences between what the regulations say and what we are actually doing to help meet those requirements as outlined in the regulations. So we'll talk about the differences between the legal or the regulatory piece and the procedural elements of GCP. So the common elements of GCP, those of which we are most familiar, 21 CFR Part 11, so electronic records and electronic signatures, and that's in parentheses because oftentimes folks still don't think of it in terms of being something that the Federal Register really believes we should be mindful of. We have seen where citations for issues with electronic systems reflect more back on 312 or 812, not keeping those adequate and accurate records. 21 CFR Part 50. So I'm going to go back to Part 11. So with these regulations that were really codified 35 years ago or so, we have seen minimal changes, but we have seen changes. So electronic records and electronic signatures, fairly static, but we've had some guidance documents come out about electronic source. As we transition more and more in the industry to electronic systems, we need to be mindful of those. Who is signing off? Who is using those systems? How are they trained? How is that system secured? And the timelines. So we'll see individuals who have access to a system who are no longer working on the study, but then we'll cross-reference that with the time that revocation request was put into the EDC administrator. And we'll see that there could be a period of time where individuals were no longer working on the study but had access. 21 CFR Part 50, the protection of human research subjects through the documentation and process of informed consent. So we have, again, seen some changes in that in terms of updates for assent, Subpart D, changes in terms of definitions of who can actually serve as a guardian, for example, or who can sign off. But most critically, more broadly for all of us, is the requirement a few years ago that if that trial is registered on clinicaltrials.gov, then that exact wording needs to be listed in the informed consent document about the trial being registered and results being available. 21 CFR Part 54, so financial disclosure. We know that prior to beginning these clinical studies, we are gathering information that might impact on the potential for bias or conflict of interest in the study. We gather this information from investigators, sub-investigators, and the answers have to reflect information for their spouses and dependent children as well. But keeping in mind just getting that piece of paper is not sufficient to show that we have minimized the potential for bias in our research. We are also obligated to follow up and develop any mitigation plans or document how we made sure that any disclosed issue is addressed appropriately. And we have certainly had recent guidance on that as well in terms of when we gather that information, how we update it, and we have seen regulatory authorities be held accountable to this because of some congressional hearings saying that we are not looking at that information as we should and we're not using that information as we should. So 21 CFR Part 56 updates to the IRBs. So the IRB, how they function, how they are structured, and we have seen changes over the last few years for that IRB to be registered. So registration with OHRP would be something that we would check, and we'd want to see the type of registration as well, not just OHRP type, but OHRP FDA type. Keeping in mind that we're required to work with an IRB in industry-sponsored research that meets the obligations of 21 CFR 56. So we would want our approval letter to reflect that, not default to the common rule, 45 CFR 46. And if we're gathering that FWA number, we have to understand that that is not going to be sufficient to indicate that that IRB is in compliance with 21 CFR 56, but rather 45 CFR 46. So some of the things that we have to think about, we have the regulations and we have common practices, but they're not always best practices for how we meet those regulatory requirements, particularly working with drugs and biologics. The back of the 1571 and the 1572, as we'll talk about here in a moment, require us to make sure that that IRB is in compliance. And, of course, statements of investigators for devices as well.